So hello, we are live to YouTube. We are just going to wait a few minutes to wait for all the stragglers to come. But in the meanwhile, chat amongst yourselves, go make yourself a cup of tea before we start, and hopefully it'll be a very enjoyable session. Well, I think we've waited long enough there. Anyone else who wants to come later can join in a minute. So, welcome to Graffiti, Making a Mark on History. Today we'll talk all about the wonderful world of historical graffiti across all England. My name is Niall Shilder. I'm a young producer with the English Heritage Shout Out Loud project. I'm also a branch assistant with Colchester Young Archaeologist Club, but most importantly for today, I am your host and will guide you mainly in the direction of our two experts today. So first of all, we have Kevin. So Kevin is a senior collections curator, must get that right, with English Heritage for the north of England, covering over 100 sites and 500,000 artifacts. That sounds like a lot of responsibility, Kevin, doesn't it?
I don't know why they give it to me, really, all that responsibility, but yes, yes. We're busy people.
So tell me a little bit, what does a senior collections curator do?
Yeah, I think you slipped in. You said creator then. My children used to call me a creator, which I quite like the idea of. I look after all the material that comes from English heritage properties, essentially. So anything that falls off, anything that's dug up, anything that used to reside in a luxurious drawing room. Yeah, that's my role, to look after bits, bobs, stuff, and collections.
Now, that sounds absolutely fascinating. Now, I understand you're quite musical as well, and you're making your own banjo. How's that going?
Slowly, and without much skill, I have to say. But it's a challenge. These things are always a challenge, and I think the idea of creating something not necessarily with much skill, but leaving your mark is exactly what this session probably is about.
Exactly. So we now move on to Fiona, who is a
hi everyone.
Who is a youth participation officer with the English Heritage Shout Out Loud team. She has a PhD in history and English literature and language and linguistics, must get that right, from the University of Sheffield. Used to work for the Royal Armouries in Leeds and is now with English Heritage. So, Fiona, what exactly does a youth participation officer actually do?
It's a very good question, Niles. Essentially, I help to deliver projects at a variety of English heritage sites in the north of England to local youth groups and local young people, trying to get them to engage with their local history and heritage and take part in some really interesting sort of creative projects linked to those sites. So yeah, it's a really great job, really enjoy it.
Yes, I understand your interests are cooking, reading, and going for long country walks with your dog Cleo. How is your dog Cleo at the moment?
Yeah, she's good. I'm surprised she's not started barking. So if you do hear any suspicious noises during the session, then I can only apologise on her behalf. But
I'm sure we'll all understand. So today, as you well know, we're looking through the wonderful world of historical graffiti. Have either of you ever made any graffiti by scratching your name into something before?
Now I can't remember ever actually creating my own graffiti, but I mean, I used to do a lot of sort of doodling on notebooks and stuff when I was at school. You know, if you're in a lesson that you're finding a little bit boring. So I can understand that raw to creating a piece of artwork, really.
Yes, Niles, I think I have actually. Yeah, no, there used to be a wood near where we grew up and where my mum grew up as well, and she scratched her initials into a tree when she was about 8, and said tree was still there. So we as a family all put our initials into the trunk of this tree as well. Sadly, I think they've been removed, but yeah, I think that's my one feral activity on the graffiti.
Well, what little scallywags you are. So, I don't know if it's time yet, but we are. Oh, hang on, I got almost there. Certainly. So it's perfect time to move on to one of the high spots of our day, the quiz, in which we'll find out exactly how much you know, or rather think you know, about graffiti. So
yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing your questions, Kevin. This will be interesting.
Yeah, well, best of luck, everyone.
So let's have the first question. Oh, by the way, before I go any further, I'll just like to remind you, put your answers either in the comments or the social media. And if you've got any questions for experts, put them either in the comments or social media, and we'll read them out at the end. So, question 1. Am I reading this out, or are you reading this out? I think I'm reading this out.
I can introduce it. I mean, this is a piece of pot. And it's from Corbridge, the Roman town on Hadrian's Wall. And it's one of very many bits of pot which have something scratched into it, but why?
Now, when I first saw this, I thought it said Neptune, so I instantly went to D, but now I can see is it Muto? Is that how you pronounce it?
Muto, probably a Tungrian, probably from current area of Belgium.
Oh, I don't know. I'm not sure. Maybe.
I think I've settled with what I think it is.
Yeah. Yeah, I think. Yeah, I'm gonna plump for A, I think.
Oh, how very unfortunate.
Oh.
So that's a Roman soldier called Muto is somewhere without his pot. How very sad of him.
Yeah, and we'll come back to each of. I think most of these slides will reappear as we talk a little later on. So I won't go into too much detail, but yeah, almost certainly the name of a Roman soldier, possibly simply marking that this is his pot. Get off.
So like this is my room, stay out kind of behaviour. Yeah.
I think I know what I want it to be on this question. It's can we decipher the inscription on the wall of Carlisle Castle?
I think you probably want it to be strange writing in code, do you, Niles? Or are you?
Oh, I definitely want it to be strange writing in code. That sounds so more exciting. Although the Egyptian hieroglyphs sound quite cool.
Yeah. Oh.
I'm pleased about that.
Your inclination was right, Niles.
Yes. Is this picture inverted by any chance? Because is that supposed to say 1850 underneath?
Well, that's cannily spotted there. Yes, I shall go back to my supplier. That's slightly embarrassing. Anyway, that's not the bit you're looking at.
Now, I've only been to Bristol out of these ones, so I don't remember it, but it could still be Bristol.
That's really difficult because there are parts of Edinburgh that do look similar, but not exactly the same as that. Although, of course, it could have changed over time. Oh,
that's a bit disappointing. Nobody knows. So, is it just an imaginary place, or is it just we haven't been able to find where it is yet?
Well, I think either of those. We don't know the answer. We have put it out across social media before to see if anyone knows. So if anyone watching this event thinks they know where that is, I'd be delighted to hear.
So how can we date how can we date these carvings? The style of lettering, the emblems, crests, the type of armor illustrated, or the comparing with the building it's carved into?
Ooh.
Now I see there's a fish, I think, and some sort of boar, and some knights, and a rose.
It's really beautiful, isn't it?
They went to a lot of time and effort.
Yeah, they are beautifully done, and well, there we go. Largely, the emblems and crests. Again, we'll come back to this one a couple of times, I think, because it is such a beautiful and intriguing piece of wall. But largely to do with the emblems and the crests that are shown. Oh, I thought there was a fifth one there, but that's disappeared into the ether. Not to worry.
Well, so now we've decided that we don't know anything about graffiti. We need to turn to our two experts, and mainly Kevin for this part, who is going to give us various. Is it the history of graffiti first? I think yes. So, Kevin. So we see graffiti all around us, in railway carriages, scribbled on the wall of buildings, and most recently we've seen it sort of sprayed on monuments. And we mainly see this as vandalism and remove it. We do,
and that perception, it's not just a perception now, that sort of sense of exactly what graffiti is. It's a legal activity, it's the sort of thing that appears in a clandestine way overnight. It can be seen as quite ugly, it affects and spoils the urban landscape. And if you look at the dictionary definition, generally they talk about writing or drawings that are scribbled or scratched illicitly, the idea of without permission onto a surface in a public space or on someone's private property. And yet, for many people, particularly those who are carrying out graffiti in this sort of contemporary sense, it's a means of expression. It's a way of communicating. It's a voice that perhaps they can't find in any other way, but they're able to express an opinion or simply, works of art. It's a way of expressing your creative passion in public that perhaps you simply wouldn't have any other opportunity of doing. So it's quite polarizing, I think, still, graffiti.
Yes, but graffiti isn't a new thing. I mean, we've seen the examples on the quiz there. There was a Roman example. It's been going on for centuries.
Centuries, millennia. We've got graffiti written by the workers creating the pyramids in Egypt. There's graffiti scratched by a Roman across beautiful wall paintings that's been preserved in Pompeii. And our castles and our churches in this country are smothered in graffiti that's been written on their walls. Yeah, this is, I suppose, the funny thing that you mentioned earlier. We tend to want to remove graffiti. We tend to want to expunge it from the record, and yet actually we're fascinated and intrigued or quite delighted by what we call historic graffiti. And where's the line between something that appears overnight now and something that's been on a monument for 50 years and we suddenly think is worthy of protection?
So why do you think that people create graffiti, or is that just in question we can't really answer?
I think you can, yes, I think you can answer it to an extent, but a lot of it is an interpretation. It's your understanding of why you think. Clearly, with modern day graffiti artists, we can ask them, but with historic graffiti, it's much more difficult to try and put yourself in the place, in the mindset of the person who's writing or drawing. Very often, this is about a name. Someone puts a name, puts a date. It's a sort of historic selfie scribbled into the wall for someone to see 100 years hence. Often there are place names, so there's sort of loyalties to the town you come from, or as we saw with that possible picture of Bristol or Edinburgh, it's a drawing of something that you remember, something that you feel passionate about. Some graffiti will give you an insight into what the author's thinking. You might have religious symbols, you might have political tract that's written down there, or you might have the crests of the regiment that you're part of, and you're expressing your loyalty to that. Graffiti can be calendars, particularly prisoners. If you've got prisoners in a space, you'll see calendars, you'll see statements that directly reveal their situation, so you can really think about what their emotion is in that place when they're creating that graffiti. And other times it's just plain fun. Other times, and it might be slightly crude, and it might be slightly vulgar, or it might be a games board that's been scratched, or it might be incomprehensible nonsense that we can't even begin to get a sense of. Just so many reasons why people might choose to inscribe something on a surface.
So across English heritage sites, how many examples of graffiti do you think there roughly are? I suspect there are quite a few.
I suspect I have no idea. Really. I mean, even on some of our, if if you look at some of our big castles, Dover, for example, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of examples of graffiti, and we have not yet had the chance to catalogue them. And in some ways, it's only in the last couple of years that we're really starting to recognise the potential research value of this resource. It's not just about the sort of superficial enjoyment of seeing someone's name scribbled. Actually, it's the potential of finding out who that is and the context in which that's being drawn. An awful lot of graffiti has been created in the last 200 or 300 years by tourists that are coming through the sites. It's then been worn away by the fingers of other tourists who've passed by and sort of inspected what's been written on the walls. But it goes right back to Roman graffiti, as we saw from Nuto writing on his pot. We have the names of soldiers from the 20th century written on roof beams, marking their regiment. And I suppose also you have graffiti that's being created all the time on our properties. And if that graffiti isn't spotted, and if it manages to last for 50 years or so, then does that suddenly become, not suddenly, does that become part of the historic record, part of the story of that site? Graffiti is just hugely varied in its form and its motivation and what it's meant to be saying and how it was created. But the thing about it is, and you can probably tell from my sort of voice running away with me, it's just funny, it's intriguing, it can be deeply poignant, and it's incredibly personal. So it's a rare insight into individuals from the past, something you can interpret about their thoughts, about their emotions, their interests, and the situation that they were in at that snapshot in time.
Funny you say that, because when I went to Helmsley Castle fairly recently, we saw an example of, I think it was 1642 graffiti, which was incredible. So I was speaking to somebody about this the other day, and they said, how do we know that that bit of graffiti is from 1642 or somebody's scratched up there last week?
Well, hopefully if it says 1642, we trust it. But I suppose there's something to do with there's the stratigraphy of the building. Now there's a word for archaeologists, but it's about the layering. It's about how you can read that graffiti in relation to the other things around it. It's about how you can look at the style of font, of text that has been used to inscribe it. It's whether, in fact, you can trace those initials of someone claiming to be there in 1642 through the historic record and get some corroboration for that. It's whether there's an anecdote from a chap down the road who says, oh yeah, when I was a 4-year-old, my brother went up there and scratched that, I remember it. So you absolutely can't take things at wall value, if you like. You have to find ways of corroborating and getting down to the detail. But I found with graffiti, you can't let that very sort of academic rigidity get in the way of an imagination as well. You have to enjoy graffiti for what it can conjure.
Thank you very much. I need to use this opportunity to remind viewers at home to put your questions either in the social media or in the comments, because we'll be asking our experts at the end. And if you do not ask the questions, there'll be no end to the session, which would be very sad. So we're now going to move on to some examples of graffiti. So Kevin, would you please give us a whistle-stop tour of graffiti across English heritage sites?
Well, I can give you a whistle-stop tour of a few examples that I've pulled together. We'd be here all day and the next day if we looked at graffiti in its broadest manifestation, I think. But we've picked out a few examples. It's very much a sort of personal selection and in a way a bit of a personal viewpoint on graffiti. But I've grouped them under 4 headings. You'll see here on the first slide, we've got a heading that's leaving your name. It's about telling people who you are and the fact that you were there. There's something about recording where you're from. That's the next group. There's something about speaking of what you believe in, what's powering you. And then there's something about graffiti simply as a sketchbook, walls as an artistic surface to express yourself on. So this one first, we saw this one in the quiz. This idea of Nuto. Is this graffiti? Because this pot probably belonged to Newton. It's probably his, and he's not illicitly scratching it on. He's quite possibly quite deliberately scratching it on, because pots like this are porous. When they've had different foods in them for a while, that they probably get quite odorous, and he probably wants to make sure that this pot is cleaned properly. And given that this pot looks the same as all the other pots in the barrack block, he wants to define it, to mark it out as being his. Archaeologists refer to this as graffiti. In the dictionary definition, debatable. But if we look at it, Fiona.
I was just thinking, because graffiti, even in sort of modern terms, can often be about ownership, can't it? So so that's quite an interesting thing, really, that he's sort of branding this pot as his and marking his ownership and staking his claim on it, perhaps.
Is it any different to putting the name in your child's school overcoat? To try and stop that disappearing? Not necessarily. But if we look at the next slide that I picked, so it's another piece of pot and it's another name scratched on it. But this one seems to have been scratched by someone called Nico, who admits to being the slave of Atticus. Now, for those who know their own pottery, this is the base of a Samian-ware dish. Samian-ware is the sort of posh tableware of the 2nd and 3rd centuries in the Roman world. Whether Nico owns this piece of posh tableware or whether it belongs to their boss Atticus, and with what permission Nico has declared their status in life, I don't know. But thank goodness they did, because it's this is one of the very few direct references to slaves up on Hadrian's Wall. It's from Corbridge, the same as the other pot.
So how many slaves do we know about, if you will? You said it wasn't very common to have direct references to slaves. Does English Heritage have many examples of that?
From the Roman world, not a great many. I mean, from Roman collections more broadly in Britain, there are a number of tombstones which refer to slaves. Either perhaps the tombstones have been erected by the slave in with thanks to their master, or the master has in some way commemorated a faithful servant. But no, not a great many. No.
I guess it's really interesting that this is something that Nico the slave has inscribed in his own hand, rather than it coming from his former owner in the form of a grave or something. That's really fascinating.
It is fascinating, and there again, I've made that a presumption that this is his own hand. We don't, of course, absolutely know that. We may make that assumption, but this was only found about 12 months ago in the collection, so it was really, really exciting moment. I think we've got some hands and feet next. We have, yes. Deal Castle, inscribing on lead. If you go to your local church roof or any historic building with lead coverings, you'll find inscriptions, people leaving their mark. This one, you can see a shoe, and you can see the line that defines its heel, and WB is marked on it, and then a hand again with WB next to it. Really common in the sort of 18th century, particularly 17th into 18th century, leaving your mark as a foot, a shoe, a hand. Depending on which hand, you can have an idea of whether this person was left or right-handed, which one have they chosen to trace around. Sometimes the shoes are much more elaborate than this, and you'll get a sense of actually the profile of the heel or the form of the buckle that is on it, which gives you an idea of the date, possibly, because it gives you a sort of contemporary fashion reference. I think the other thing about lead roofs, we're finding that the amount of time it would take to do some of these inscriptions rather suggests that the person who was getting access to the space had been given access to the space, and it was sort of understood that this is what's going on. You let someone at the top of the church for a view, and they're likely to leave their mark. So it's graffiti that's sort of illicit, but sort of sanctioned.
So this is going to sound an odd question. Can we date it by whether it's left or right-handed? Because I heard that most people who are right-handed only became right-handed when they started training knights with their right hand.
Do you know, I don't know the answer to that, but we see handedness, if you like, in ceramics. You can see how a pot's being made as to whether left or right-handed. You can see bias in your sort of handedness through an awful lot of things. So I'm not sure. I think I don't think you can really date it from that. Shall we move on? This is our
secret code.
Back to front.
Yes.
This is back to front. So it's not an Egyptian hieroglyph left at Carlisle Castle, which is a great shame because it would rewrite the history somewhat. We're looking at the scribbles on the upper stone there, and they are a form of shorthand. Shorthand is that, in the old days, before, when I was young, before we had computers, you wrote everything, and shorthand was a way of very quickly expressing text, particularly if you were taking dictation, if you were listening to someone and writing it down. And a chap called Isaac Pitman in the 1830s, forgive me, created a form of shorthand, and sort of did the equivalent of today's online learning that we've all been done, but sends out postcards with his lessons on to his tutorials to his students, and they would send in postcards back showing how well they'd formed his letters. And we found this one at Conisbrough, and when we worked out it was Pitman's shorthand, we then worked out it said George Piper, or GP, and we could trace George Piper through the Conisbrough records, town and parish records, to find he lived there in the 1870s and the 1880s. He'd been a wheelwright, he became a draftsman, he had 5 children, and he perhaps took Pitman's shorthand learning course as a way of self-improvement, and there he is expressing it rather finely detailed. You can tell he's a draftsman on the walls of Conisbrough.
That's incredible. You can tell so much just from those marks.
Yeah.
And most people just ignore them. They would say, "Oh, that's just scratches on the bricks, aren't they?" Yeah,
they left us bemused for quite a long time. But then someone clicked. Someone thought, "Oh, just look up some of the shorthand techniques," and it pinged out.
It's amazing.
Well, we said a little bit about this one. Ideas of where you're from. I mean, this is from inside the cell block at Richmond Castle, which is absolutely littered with place names and with drawings of places and of buildings that must have been familiar. Really strong sort of links and loyalties. There's even a whole landscape of the river of the North Tyne in there, showing the little buildings and little villages that populate it along the way. A real sort of need, it seems, to express I'm from there, I attach myself to that place. Now, as we've talked about, we don't know where this particular one is. I'm still hopeful. I thought Edinburgh as well, but I can't connect it with any view in modern day Edinburgh.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So if anyone does know in the audience, then you'd be keen to hear their answers, Kevin.
I'd be very keen to hear any suggestions, and we'll follow them up. Yeah.
It could possibly be of Edinburgh, but maybe a fictitious perspective, if you will, sort of.
Well, that's really interesting, because in the same building there are views of Newcastle on Tyne and the River Tyne and the bridges, and they are incredibly accurate, but obviously still from memory. So you see certain buildings that have shifted position and perhaps have been put into the view because they're favoured buildings, and it's a confection of a view rather than a true to life one. So that's sort of ideas pictorially, where am I from, physically where I'm from, and then there are other ways of speaking about where you originate from. Next slide. So we come back to these. This is Carlisle Castle, and a lot of graffiti, you can express where you're from in sort of emotionally, or with loyalties, or where you're from in the hierarchy, status-wise, social class-wise. You can express that. So here we see elements of heraldic crests that link to Richard, Duke of Gloucester, later became Richard III. He was He presided over as Lord Warden of Carlisle for a period in the late 15th century. So we have the boar down the bottom there, and you can see some roses, the Yorkshire rose, so symbols of Richard III. Whoever's carving this is very much linking themselves with their current lord's power and status. Now, as you pointed out, the fish as well, the fish and the scallop shells you can see, they link to the Dacre family, who owned a lot of property in this area, Lanercost Priory, Narworth Castle, but really powerful, important figures. So whoever, many people potentially who are layering this graffiti, seems to be late 15th century, seems to be statements of loyalty.
It's very beautifully done as well. It's so artistic.
We get some geologies really give themselves to this kind of fine carving. They're quite soft, but they're very fine grained. But it tends to mean that we lose them very quickly as well, because poor conditions or people's fingers will wear them away. So this is quite a rare and exceptional survival. So I think we'll probably rattle through these, and we'll definitely rattle through this one because the photograph is so poor we can't see it. Ideas of loyalty, this is regimental loyalty. It actually refers to a chap who's from the 7th Battalion of the Black Watch, and he's stationed at Belsay Hall during the Second World War. And we see this across many of our properties. This is who we are. This is the regiment I'm from. I'm proud of that. And then what do you believe in? If you go onto the English Heritage website, go onto the Richmond Castle pages, you'll see this graffiti and many others. This one's by John Hewett Brocklesby, 22nd of May 1916. There he is, prostrate beneath the cross. He leaves a number of religious statements, and Richmond has verses from the Bible and hymns and other sort of religious tract proliferating around. But as we saw from the previous slide with Carlisle as well, you have IHS appearing there, Jesus, and crucifixes are very common, you see as well. So what do you believe in? Religious, political? Well, I think we've got a political one next, have we? I can't recall. Oh, less political. Look at this. What's that? Quickly, Niles, any idea? Well, it says it at the bottom. So you...
It's a fox eating a chicken.
Oh, that's brilliant. I don't know how you spotted that. Yes. A warning, the fox preaching to the hen. Which hen would really want to be told what to do by a fox? So again, it's a sort of classic, well, in this case, late 15th into the 16th century, warnings against false prophets, against listening to voices that perhaps are not speaking the truth of the Lord.
Mm.
And then wall surfaces as sketchbooks that you can just create art on. Sometimes, possibly like this gentleman, this is meant to be a sketch of someone you knew. There's an idea that because they've got a big nose, this one's affectionately known as Old Nosy. Does it relate to the Duke of Wellington, who was Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports at the time that this is created? But many times they're just joins of faces, profiles of people that you can't really trace in the cultural record. They're pieces of imagination, and they're, it's you practicing your craft on a wall because you can, because you have some time set aside, and thank you very much, I'll crack on.
So it's a bit like me doodling in my notebooks at school then, Kevin.
Yeah, and the greatest example of doodling will come up in a couple of slides' time, but there's one quite nice one coming up next. Byland Abbey, barely distinguishable, faint lines scratched onto a wall. Thought when we saw them for the first time about 15 months ago, thought that they were just fairly casual, fairly haphazard, didn't really mean anything. Once you get some scanners on it and some, raking light and a bit of clever photography, you realise there's actually a design here. There's a pattern forming, and it would appear to be 11th century graffiti. It's 11th century lines setting out what the great rose window that is placed immediately above this piece of wall would look like. So it's your blueprint for the architecture that you're in the business of constructing in the late 11th century. It's a fabulous, fabulous survival. And then last in this ridiculously rapid tour of graffiti English heritage, the battle scene at Richmond Castle. It's one of my favourite things. Created over about 50 years by a whole series of different people who had reason to be in this building. It starts, I think, with a bit of landscape from the Boer War. Niles, you will love this.
It's great, isn't it?
Military history. There are First World War biplanes and zeppelins. There are Second World War submarines and dogfights going on in the sky. And there's even sort of a putative early rocket, perhaps a V2 rocket from the Second World War, that comes landing in. Such a complex scene. We thought we'd try and unpick it to make it more intelligible, and we made a little animation which, if technology allows us, we'll be able to see. Fingers crossed, everyone.
They're beautiful drawings. Yeah, I can't wait to see this.
That's so good.
Amazing, yeah.
And everything you saw there is on the wall.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that's got nearly 50 years of military history, all on just scribblings.
Yeah, we'll try and send you that video specifically, Niall, so you can treasure that one, because I think you probably appreciate that. That's our rapid tour across graffiti. I hope that's probably provoked some questions, a little bit of thought and response from those of you watching. I wait in trepidation.
Well, thank you very much. Now we need to move on to Buick Barracks, but before we do, I just need to very quickly remind you to ask questions. We've had some questions come through, which proves we're not just doing this to ourselves. There are people watching out there. And remember, in the words of Mark Twain, that he who asks is a fool for 5 minutes, but he who doesn't is a fool forever. Now, ask those questions to Fiona, who is going to tell us a bit about a project she did with the Flodden Yak in Buick Barracks.
Yes, yeah. So Buick Barracks have some really interesting examples of graffiti created by the soldiers that were living in the barracks in the 18th century. They created their own stencils and burnt around the stencils on the walls and on the ceilings of the rooms that they were living in. So we refer to them as the smoke drawings. They're really, really beautiful. So I've put together a PowerPoint with some photos of the project that I delivered with Flodden Young Archaeologists Club at the barracks, so that you can see what we got up to. And at the end of the PowerPoint, we've also got some audio clips from some of the young participants, so you can hear about their experiences of the project directly. So the project was delivered between November 2019 and February 2020. Flodden Young Archaeologists Club, or Flodden Yak, meet regularly at Museums Northumberland. So we collaborated with both organisations. Museums Northumberland is actually on the same site as Berwick Barracks. However, before the project, most of the participants hadn't actually visited the English Heritage Site, and they didn't really know anything about its history. So this project aimed to change this and help the club sort of respond creatively to their local history. It also aimed to provide Flod and Yak with a new focus during the winter months when the weather is particularly bad in the north of England, and they can't really get out and do a great many archaeological digs. So yes, we focused on the smoke drawings found on the site, and the participants were particularly surprised by these images. So the project took place over 8 half-day sessions. So in the first session, the 12 Young Archaeologists Club members were given a behind-the-scenes tour of the barracks by the collections curator. And on this tour, they got to see the smoke drawing. So you can see an example of that now on the screen on the left. So we think these are some self-portraits that the soldiers created of themselves. And the members of the group also got to visit the mob store, which is an outbuilding which stores interesting historical and archaeological items from not only the barracks, but also local sites like Norham Castle. So that's a photo on the right there of the mob store. So following this, we took part in a series of workshops to learn a bit more about the history of the site. So we visited the Berwick upon Tweed record office. So the young people got to learn some skills in paleography, so how to read old-fashioned handwriting. And then they investigated 300-year-old transcripts relating to soldiers living in the town of Berwick upon Tweed in the 18th century. So you can see one of the Young Archaeologists Club members there having a look at a very old document relating to the soldiers. On the next slide, we've got some images of our creative workshop. So this was delivered by a creative facilitator from Love Science. And the club learned about the process of creating the smoke drawings, what actually went into producing them. And then they had a go at making their own plaster and decorating these with airflow ink designs of their own modern smoke drawings. So you can see an example on the left there of, again, one of the smoke drawings created by the soldiers in the 18th century. And on the right, one of our modern interpretations, which I think looks really, really good. And then following this, we had 4 sessions with Corrupt Animation, who taught us all about stop motion animation and helped the young people turn their modern smoke drawings into a short animation film. And in the final session, we screened the animation for the young people to reflect on and to discuss the skills they'd learned and what their favourite parts of the project are. So in a moment, we'll hear from those young people. But as you'll hear from them, not only did the Young Archaeologists Club members get the chance to learn about paleography and plaster making and animation, but they all reflected that they'd learned new things about their local heritage in a fun and interesting way. And they felt that they gained confidence in talking and working with others. So yes, it was a really fantastic project. So I'll hand over now to the voices of some of our young participants so you can hear a bit more from them.
Well, I had to, this is the first time I knew this was called the Byland Barracks. And that was the first time I'd been, like not been, but experienced it. Yeah. So really for our first time, it was really good. Oh, brilliant. I'm pretty inspiring. Well, I was pretty surprised about the smoke drawings because I never knew soldiers and did that kind of stuff.
That is interesting, isn't it? Now that you guys have finished the project, what are your top 3 highlights or favourite things?
Well, my first favourite thing is like seeing things that normal people would normally not, to that Big M said, with the gnome balls, the old toilets, old post boxes, and that was really fun.
Brilliant. So like the behind the scenes
Yeah.
stuff. Yeah.
But the other thing I really like books I've actually never known, like I never knew they were doing smoke drones, so I quite like looking at the smoke drones as well.
Brilliant, yeah. Was there anything that you found quite difficult or a bit challenging when you were doing the project?
Well, I kind of probably everybody found this challenging when we went to the archives.
Yeah, that was quite challenging.
Yeah, to work out the words, that was really challenging.
Quite challenging.
Do you think differently about Berwick Barracks now that you've finished the project?
No, since I haven't been since since a long time ago, so I can't really remember. But for the first time, great.
And do you think you'll be coming back again now?
Yes. Probably, not 100% sure, but probably.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you want to say about the film that you made or about the project that you'd like?
It's really good. It's quite fun to make, and consider doing archaeology. There, done.
Well, thank you so much. Well, I reckon that, I think it was a boy, I think he's after your job, Kevin. I think in 10 years' time, he'll be there with all his degrees and things.
Yeah, and I hadn't heard that before. That was a real treat. That was absolutely.
Oh, good. Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Yeah.
So that brings us to the questions. Before we go on, I do to apologise. I've realised I've been mispronouncing Berwick Barracks all the time. I'm saying Berwick Barracks, which is evidently completely wrong. It's been a day of mispronunciation for me today. But never mind. So shall we see what the questions are? Because it's become the highlight of the day. So let's see. Let's open it up. So the one at the top, is a question for Kevin, this one, from Imogen. At Dover Castle, there is some crude graffiti from prisoners of war in the 18th century. Was this a common occurrence?
Yes, at Dover, and yes, across a lot of castles, Imogen. From sort of wars, I think French wars of the independence in the early 18th century, and then the Napoleonic Wars towards the end of the century. And these great medieval tower keeps were sort of obsolete by then. So what better thing to do than turn them into prisons? And you see it at Porchester, and you see it at Lancaster in the north. You see it all across the country. These huge Norman buildings being turned into prisons, and the prisoners just elaborating their thoughts across the walls. And they're an extraordinarily important resource for understanding who those prisoners were when they're at Dover and what they're thinking.
Thank you very much. Now we've got another question for Kevin. We're making you work for your money today. So it's from a person called JEFA, whoever that is. So in Gloucester Cathedral, there is some royal graves. Was this common?
Yes, absolutely. Royal graves, so they may, I don't know, JSA, they may have figures, they may be full tombs, or they may just be grave slabs, and what you're seeing is sort of the inscribed lines of perhaps a cross, or sometimes a sword, or sometimes the vision of the figure with their hands in prayer. Sometimes what you're seeing are the lines which mark out where there'd be colourful or shiny brass inlaid into the tops of tombstones. Now, what we do find is many tombstones are lifted, particularly in old monasteries where their buildings have been torn apart. Tombstones are lifted and they're upturned and they're used for something else, and you end up with lots of layers of graffiti essentially being scribed onto these lovely slabs of marble or slate, and you get a whole layering of messages from their first use as a royal tombstone through to their last use perhaps as a carelessly created board game for playing on a picnic one Sunday in the 19th century.
Fascinating. Now, this is a question for the panel. from somebody called Knitting Made Easy. I'm taking it as that's not their name they're born with. So, do you have a favourite piece of graffiti? Well, I'd say for me, it would have to be that battle one we saw earlier.
Yeah, that is beautiful. I think my loyalty has to lie with the smoke drawings at Berwick Barracks. And amongst the drawings, they have a lot of different animals and creatures. And there's one that the Young Archaeologists Club couldn't decide whether they thought it was a goat or a unicorn. So I think the unicorn goat has to be my favourite, just because we had a lot of discussions about that one.
Yeah, the unicorn goat. Well, what does it remember? I do love the battle scene, but at Thornton Abbey Gatehouse, which is in North Lincolnshire, we're on a really tight spiral stair. Next to a window, there's a little drawing, a scratch drawing of a post mill, a windmill, one of the post mills, which sort of rotated on the post, and you can sit on the steps of the stair and you can look out of the window and you know that this person was looking at a post mill in the landscape of 18th century Lincolnshire and simply recording on the wall what they could see. And that's probably one of my favourites.
Perfect. Well, we've got another question for you here, Kevin, from a person called Claire Corkill. Do you try to preserve any of the graffiti on heritage buildings, or do you record them and leave them to naturally weather?
I'm going to assume, Claire, you're talking about what we're calling historic graffiti rather than modern. Modern graffiti we do try and record just as part of the record, but then remove actively. Historic graffiti, we're trying to protect it, trying to conserve it. Going back to Richmond, we spent the last 4 years and an awful lot of scientific research trying to work out how to preserve the particular circumstances of that building and stop the walls peeling. At Dover, which a previous questioner came up with, they used to be covered. The technique was always to put glass screens over them so that people couldn't rub them with their hands. What that does is create what we call a little micro environment between the glass and the wall, which means you end up with getting all sorts of environmental conditions that the particular wall doesn't like, and the thing starts flaking more quickly. So whatever you do has to be based on science and has to be based on an understanding of the materials that the graffiti is cut into. And often it just isn't possible. So a detailed record and a detailed archive is the only way forward.
Very good, because we've got another question for you here from somebody who refers to themselves as the antisocial elf. How do you deal?
Sorry, I thought I was the antisocial elf.
I think we're all antisocial elves.
Okay.
So how do you deal with modern graffiti on English heritage sites?
We jump up and down in a rage and say, how could they? And then we stop someone just wanting to go with a bucket of bleach and scrub it off, because that doesn't do much good for the actual historic monument that the thing is on. And particularly if this is a fine piece of stuccoed surface on an 18th century mansion, you want to be very, very careful with what you're using to remove it. But yes, our approach is to remove it, is not to encourage that sort of layer of record to accrete and to grow and to overlay, because who knows where it stops. And graffiti is, it is still generally an illegal, unwanted activity. It's a very difficult balance, but no, we do actively look to remove, but we have to be incredibly careful and sensitive about how we do it. There was a real spate of people wanting to spray things on Hadrian's Wall about a decade ago, and it's hugely expensive to remove this stuff properly. It's and there's a bit of cat and mouse. It comes in cycles, it seems.
So we now got a long question from somebody called Opera Love. I love opera too, Mr. Opera Love. So they say, hello.
Hello.
Can you tell us something about the inverted double V sign often found? I think it's often associated with both Elizabeth I and the I can't read that word, Marin. I think it's Maori tradition cult. Then it goes on. It's a long question, isn't it? We have one locally on a piece of graffiti, and we think it links to Roman Catholicism circa 17th century. But not sure how to process identifying it correctly. It's next to a large this is an interesting word. I'm a bit on the dyslexic side, everyone, so you've got to bear with me here. Graffito. I don't know what that word says. We're going to have to imagine it.
Graffito, singular graffiti.
Oh, graffito.
Oh, I didn't realise graffiti was a plural. Says the person with a PhD in English. That's quite embarrassing.
Charles, we got the sort of sense of that one. It's the inverted double V. I have to say, Fiona, I really think you should answer this. No, I don't know of any connections with Elizabeth I or any particular sort of cultural thing. I've always understood it when surveying graffiti, particularly when as an archaeologist looking at buildings. It's a very common form from as a mason mark. So left by the mason who has cut that stone, and there's debate as to why masons leave marks, but it's generally felt that if they leave a mark on a stone, they're claiming that stone and they're claiming the money, the pay for having cut the piece. And you will see all different forms, but the inverted W is certainly one. It is, I've seen that form certainly in the 18th century, and there are symbols that relate specifically to religion or perhaps to witches. You can see daisy wheels which will appear around the place, which there's a word, isn't there? Fiona, perhaps what's the word for the anti-witch symbol? I can't remember it now. So some of these things do appear over and over again and look very similar on different monuments at different dates. With apologies, opera lover, I don't know the possible connection with either Elizabeth I or other religious matters.
That's really interesting. I must admit, I can't think off the top of my head of the word for sort of anti-witchcraft symbols. But it's interesting that you were saying about sort of masons leaving their mark, perhaps seeking payment. I know of a bridge in Cambridge where the mason didn't receive payment, and they actually put a chunk of stone from one of the decorative spheres on top of the bridge. So perhaps if you didn't pay your mason after they left that mark, then the next step was to reclaim some of the stone that they'd used. So you never know.
I know at Colchester Castle there's a witch's mark on the one of the spiral staircases, and it's sort of like a flower-like shape inside a circle. It's quite interesting.
Yes, that's one of the ones I was thinking about in the sort of warding against witches and other spirits. That exactly that symbol. Yeah, it's got a specific name, and I cannot recall it.
So we've got another question from a chap called Lawrence. Hello, Lawrence. What experience, I think it says, have you had with tree graffiti? I suppose apart from you scratching your name into a tree. If so, how does work with this differ from buildings?
No, Lawrence, no specific experience, largely because that sort of thing sadly doesn't survive on our estate. How would it differ? Well, there'd be a conservation aspect to it, which would differ how you actually record it, look after it, or decide to remove it. But in all other essences, it's graffiti. You look at it in the same way, whether it's been written on a piece of pottery, scribbled on a wall surface, or whether it's been cut into a tree. It's still about the motivation behind it. It's about trying to understand what the graffiti is actually trying to tell us, trying to work out its date, and seeing whether that has any sort of bigger picture, broadens the picture of understanding of the monument in general. So no, it shouldn't really be viewed any differently, apart from, as I say, in how you might protect or look after it.
First class. Now we've got some comments here, and this person called Ms. Campbell1 has got a lead for us on the graffiti where we don't know where it's set.
Oh, that's exciting.
I've got my pen. Hang on, getting my pen.
So she says that it looks like, is it Prince St Gardens area towards Waveney, St Edinburgh.
Yeah.
So near the train station, really, then.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? It's in that's what I wondered. Princess Gardens, Princess Street, yes. In the dip where the railway line runs through. It just looks so much like that with the raised level bridge coming across and the.
That's what I thought when I first saw it, I must admit. But then I suppose that area has modernised so much with the railway station there that perhaps it's just that we can't see it as they would have seen it previously.
I think clearly I need to be given the expenses to take a train to Edinburgh now that we're allowed. And I'll report back, everyone, after a nice day sightseeing.
Excellent. Yeah, any excuse to go visit Edinburgh, I think, is worthwhile.
So we've got another comment. This is from that person Knitting Made Easy again. And they say it's brilliant, love it. A brilliant atmosphere, love it, they said.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you very much.
Evidently, somebody appreciates it. So we've got another question here for Kevin. When does graffiti become art? Do you think the reason we view modern graffiti differently is the size and medium, i.e. spray paint?
Yes, that is a tricky one. I mean, art. I've struggled with this one. I've thought about this a lot. I think you're right that a lot of graffiti is it's very in your face, isn't it? It's absolutely, you can't avoid it. It's not discreet. It's not tucked away in a corner in a slightly embarrassed way. It is absolutely upfront. And I think also because a lot of street art, murals, etc., are now commissions. So they are commissioned works of art which happen to look stylistically and take a form that is very similar to graffiti that has emerged from sort of the underground experience and cultural experience. So it's quite difficult. And you look at the work by Banksy, and he's done another one in the tube trains this week. Is that graffiti? Is that art? Of course, why can't one be the other? Clearly, they are, and that's becomes then a matter of judgment. There was a second part of that. What was it, Niall?
To do with the medium, spray paint.
Yes, again, no, I think we've probably covered that, haven't we? I think that has become so much the sort of people's view of graffiti is that sort of spray paint tradition, which is from the 1970s New York, I suppose, onwards has formed that sense of what graffiti is. But we know from our sites, and I know from spaces in just where I live, that the tradition of just marking your little initials and perhaps in a love heart crossed out with another couple of initials that you probably embarrassed by 6 months later. That's still hale and hearty. We still see plenty of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as you say, Kevin, there's perhaps we treat street art differently from sort of tagging your name or tagging initials. I know that my partner and I are often intrigued by some graffiti that there is locally where someone's tagged their name, but it also happens to be the same name as an obscure mathematician. So we're often wondering, is this graffiti artist referencing the mathematician, or do they just happen to have the same very rare name? So yeah, so actually it's quite thought-provoking.
Mr. Einstein is excellent.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have time for no more, which is very sad because we're all just getting into it, but never mind. So I'd like to say thank you to Fiona and Kevin. You've been absolutely wonderful. Thank you for the audience for watching, if indeed you still are. And especially thank you for the people who put questions in. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had an end to that video. And of course, we all enjoyed ourselves. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Niles. Thank you.